Amy Dretta's car, and she was fine.
Should I?
Sure.
Ready?
Yeah.
I'm going to still read the latest book, so I can plug the latest book. So, welcome everyone. How's my sound level in the right here? But it makes us feel good to have a microphone in front of us. So this is Lori Duffy Foster. Lori is, I called her a mystery novelist, but also suspense novelist. And this novel is certainly suspense as much as anything
Mystery,
else.
thriller, suspense.
Yeah. And the latest book is called Never Let Go, which I just read, which is terrific. And I'll tell you a little bit about Lori. She is a former crime reporter, so I want to ask a lot of questions. And she writes from the hills of northern Pennsylvania. I like that.
Because no one knows where Austinburg is.
Does anybody know where Austinburg is? No. Okay. She is a member of the Mystery Writers of America, the Sisters in Crime. Wow. Is that actually deep? The Sisters
Yeah,
in
we have chapters all over.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Lot of fun together.
yeah, I can imagine. That's the Historical Novel Society of the International Troll Writers and Private Eyes Writers of America and Panic Writers. So she's been doing this for how long?
Well, I've only been published since 2021. But
Oh, really?
yeah, 2021.
Wow. You're
but I've been
prolific.
writing fiction for about 20 years.
Okay.
Yeah, it took a while.
And crime reporting?
Crime reporting was about 11 years. Well, 11 years as a reporter, and about 6 of those as a crime reporter.
Okay.
Crime writer.
And later we'll tell you why the crime is easier to see in small towns than it is in cities. Lori Duffy Foster.
Thank you. I'm only here. You're with me. So, hi, I'm Lori Duffy Foster. I guess I'll tell you a little bit more about how I got here first. Like George said, I was a crime reporter. I'm from the Adirondacks originally. I was born and raised there. Went to SUNY Oswego and Binghamton University, and ended up at the Post Standard in Syracuse, where I worked for 11 years. And for a lot of that, most of it, I did cover crime. 3 years in the rural areas, and then 3 years in the city, which, as I was telling George, was a very different experience, but very, very good for fiction. One thing I came to find when I was covering crime was that I'm very interested in human behavior and why we do the things we do, what makes us break our own social and moral codes, that kind of thing. And crime is the perfect intersection for that, to study that. So for me, that was fantastic. But the thing was, I loved the writing, I loved the interviewing, I loved the investigative stuff, I loved being creative, I loved all that, but I really didn't like the business. I never wanted to be an editor, I never wanted to move to a bigger paper, I didn't want to do any of that, I wanted to write fiction. So when my husband got a job transfer to Arizona, we thought that's the perfect time for me to write fiction. Except I found out I was pregnant when I got there. so I spent the next several years. My son was born, and I thought, okay, I'm going to write that novel now. Even though I have to work part-time still, I'm going to write that novel and just write while he sleeps. But he never slept. So and I was working on a historical novel, which I learned takes an awful lot of research. So I spent 6 years writing that novel, working part-time and raising kids and writing it. And then another 3 years sending out to beta readers and developmental editors and just trying to make it the best I could. Then I entered it in the Amazon Breakthrough Novel Contest, and I ended up a quarter finalist. So I was all excited and thought, this is it, I'm going to get published. And I got an agent, and he was a dud. It was a long story short, he didn't submit it after the first 6 months. He lied to me for 18 months. And so I got nowhere, but I don't know if any of you have read Matthew McConaughey's book. He talks about whenever you encounter a red light, making it into a green light. And that's kind of what happened to me. It's every time I didn't get published, it turned out to be a good thing. And part of it was I didn't know the business. And had I gotten published younger when I wasn't ready, I think I would have made a lot of mistakes. I mean, I have a friend who got published for Big Five, and got 3 books published. Her next book was terrible. But her editor had kind of let it slide, her agent had let it slide, and then Random House dropped her, fired her editor, her agent dropped her, and now she can't really get picked up anywhere else. So she got here too soon, and then now she's here and has to try to get back up there. So I'm kind of grateful that I didn't get published till later. I spent the rest of the time trying to get published, writing more books. And by the time I signed with Level Best, which is my publisher now, back in 2019, I had 5 books written. And they gave me a contract for the series, which is 3 books, one of which wasn't written yet. And then a year later, a contract for the 3 standalones. So that historical courtroom drama will eventually be published by Level Best. We're debating whether it's going to be this coming December or the following December. Right now, it's slated for this coming December, but we'll see. So that was my path to fiction, and now my youngest two are 16, so it's a lot easier for me to come and do things like this without worrying about what they're up to, because they're a little rambunctious, as you know. So the timing was good, and I'm really enjoying it. And I was telling George too, I had intended to write more of what I wrote with that the historical courtroom drama, a little bit more on the literary end, but I just couldn't seem to stay away from that crime stuff. For me, it's fascinating. It's a way to talk about social issues in a way that entertains, but also brings those issues to light for people. And it's just, for me, it's a good place to be. Although I think eventually I'll go back to more of that historical writing. So that's me.
I'm smiling because I don't know where my 16-year-old is right now.
Oh, yeah? Mine are at a basketball game, so we're good there. One plays basketball. So should I go ahead and read now?
Oh, please, yeah.
Okay, so I was going to read a little bit from Never Let Go. Oops. This Never Broken in a Dead Man's Eyes are part of a series featuring Lisa Jameson, who's a journalist who got pregnant at 15 and put herself through college with the help of her foster parents, and is now her daughter 16 in the first novel. And Never Let Go is a thriller. So, I'll take a drink of this first. Actually, I want to read from the one in my bag so I don't ruin that one, if you don't mind. Should have pulled it out sooner. Okay. All right, so Never Let Go, I'll read to you the blurb from the back too, just so you understand where it is coming from. Most people have nightmares while they sleep. Carla Murphy awakens to find herself living one. Carla is excited when her best friend asks her to lunch and tells her to bring the baby. Rachel dislikes children and had been distant throughout Carla's pregnancy. But Carla should have known that people don't change that quickly. Lunch was a ruse. Carla emerges from a drug-induced slumber, sealed in a room in Rachel's basement, with her son Dom. Her best friend is no friend. She's obsessed with Carla's husband. It will kill them both if she doesn't get what she wants. Carla has no choice. She must help Rachel, her confidant since childhood, seduce her husband or they all die, and her baby will be lost to her forever. So, my kids worry about me. None of them have read this one. I'm not sure about it. Okay, I'm going to read to you from the beginning, because the problem with suspense is when you try to read from the middle or closer to the end, you end up giving stuff away. So that's why I'm going to start from the beginning. She had filled the tub as high as she dared, yet her naked belly broke the surface, a pale and soft island in the stillness of the water. Her fingers trembled as she ran them along the exposed skin. Friends had warned her that it would take months for her abdomen to tighten again, but she hadn't believed them. 6 months after giving birth to Christopher, and she still had a bit of dough. Now she was glad for it. It reminded her that he was out there. Her baby was real and he was alive. If she died, he would still live. But as soon as this image came to mind, the ceiling and the walls began closing in around her. The air grew thin and hot. Christopher crying, Christopher hungry, Christopher cold and alone. She gripped the edges of the tub and jerked her body into a sitting position, gasping for air. What do you think you're doing? The accusation echoed off the walls, the concrete walls that caged her in the small rectangular room. The water had been so soothing, she'd nearly forgotten where she was. How could she do that? How could she forget for even 1 second that she was trapped here, sealed in this room with no windows, with only a small vent for air? Her breath came rapidly now, and she struggled to slow it down, counting a new rhythm in her head. Was she losing her mind already? She could not let that happen. She grabbed for the towel she had set on the toilet cover and stood quickly, fumbling with the rough terry cloth as she wrapped it around her body, unsure where to look as she spoke. My muscles hurt, my chest, everything. I thought it might help. Her voice quivered, and she hoped it wasn't obvious. She didn't, sorry. She didn't want to show her fear, or maybe she should. Maybe that was what Rachel wanted. Maybe Rachel needed to witness her desperation. It hurt so badly, this intense need to see her baby, to hold her baby, to caress his soft skin, and breathe in his newness. The pain exhausted her, overwhelmed her. She was certain she would break inside, under the force of it all, and collapse within herself. His 6-month birthday was yesterday. She pulled the towel more tightly around her body and stared at the stained and cracked floor, fighting to regain control of her emotions, fighting off the claustrophobia and the panic that came with it. Did you have a good soak? The faceless voice that boomed from a speaker mounted high in the corner was once welcome and familiar to Carla. It was a whisper of conspiracy in the dark when they were 10 years old and sneaking downstairs late at night for ice cream. It was a call from a cafeteria table giving her direction and a sense of belonging on the first day of junior high. It was the harmony they sang as they sang with their playlists on the drive to the movie theater on a Saturday night. But this voice had changed. This voice was thick with confidence, control, and loathing. It was terrifying. Carla didn't know this Rachel. Remember that spa we went to for your 16th birthday? Rachel said, a little more kindly now. Just you and me. Your mom dropped us off with a boatload of money for the day. That was nice, relaxing in those massage chairs with cucumbers on our eyes and mud on our faces. We went out to dinner after the spa and later brought you a piece of cake with a candle in it. Remember that, Carla? Your mom loved me. She liked having me around. That was why she sent me with you, because she loved me like a daughter. It was like she was giving me a present too. Carla closed her eyes and took deep, slow breaths. She focused on steadying her voice, despite the weakness in her legs and the tremors in her hands. This was a good memory, a connection. Rachel had to be insane. Why else would she do this? Maybe she had ghosts in her childhood Carla didn't know about. Was Rachel's mother abusive in some way? She couldn't remember. They spent most of their time at Carla's house as kids because Carla was an only child and Rachel shared a bedroom with her older sister. But it never occurred to Carla that there might be another reason. If she was abused, the fact that Carla became a mother recently might have stirred something awful, some horrible memories she'd never shared, never spoken about, maybe not to anyone. Carla's mother was always good to Rachel. Maybe that was the key, the way out of this dungeon. You and my mom, you got along well. She's probably worried sick, Rachel said. Rachel, did you tell her I'm okay? Carla focused on the camera, which was mounted under a clear plexiglass dome in the center of the ceiling. Did you tell her where I am? You don't want to hurt her, do you? You need to let me go. Carla kept her eyes trained on the camera as she stepped out of the tub, her legs still shaky. She wasn't sure why she'd filled the tub and climbed into it. She'd done it without thinking. Once it was full, she was drawn into the water with visions of turning it red, of slitting her wrists and ending the nightmare with its warmth. It would all be over. No more pain, no more panic, no more fear. But there were 3 problems with their plan. The tiny room was void of anything sharp. A camera followed her every move, and she didn't really want to die. As long as she remained alive, so did the chance she would get out of this place and hold Christopher in her arms once more. Your mom? Rachel laughed. She deserves to suffer a little. She's a bitch, Carla. You know that. She never cared about you. You're a clumsy introvert with your nose always stuck in a book. You're an embarrassment to her. Having me around, that's what made you bearable to her. Think, Carla, I'm the only one who ever cared about you. Not even Nick cares, really. He'll forget about you as soon as someone else spreads your legs for him. But don't worry, I won't let him hook up with just anyone. I'll make sure it's me. It was always me he wanted. You seduced Nick and confused him, and now we have to fix this. It'll work out, and we'll all be happier, even you. I'm doing this because I love you. You're scared now, and you don't understand, but you'll see. Carla breathed longer and deeper, keeping the tears at bay. She'd read about this after one of those famous kidnappings, about how kidnappers like to make their victims feel emotionally and physically isolated. They degrade them and destroy them, and make them submissive and dependent. That's what Rachel was trying to do by saying her mother didn't love her, and by telling her Nick didn't care about her either. Rachel had already succeeded in making her physically isolated and dependent. And now she was working on the emotional part. She would not let her win. Carla sank down onto the twin mattress on the floor, just a few feet from the tub, and covered her face with her free hand. What did Rachel want? Did she want to see her cry? Did she want her to get angry? Did she want her to agree? She could do those things. She could fake it. She would do anything to get out of there, but she didn't know what to say or do. And she was tired of trying to figure it out, just so tired. I was going to send you some breakfast, Rachel said, but I've changed my mind. You have to learn to respect me or we'll never get anywhere. I don't think you realize how much I do for you. This whole thing wasn't easy. And maybe after you've gone hungry long enough, you'll understand you need my permission to take a bath. I have to get to work now, and I've got to go see that husband of yours. He's pretty distraught, since his wife took off with their baby. He needs me right now. Carla flew up from the mattress. No, don't leave me again. She pleaded with the camera, hoping Rachel would meet her eyes and see her, really see her. Her heart quickened, and her chest, already aching, felt like it might break. She couldn't breathe. What if she ran out of air, out of water? There was no way out. It was a concrete grave. She didn't care how desperate she looked. She'd do anything at all to keep Rachel there. She couldn't bear to be left alone again. Talk to me, that's all. I'll be good. I need to hear your voice. Please, Rachel. You're my friend too. If it's Nick you want, you can have him. I'll divorce him. I'll never speak to him again. Please, just don't leave me alone. I'm scared. I won't tell anybody. I'll say I ran away, that I had a breakdown or something. You won't get in any trouble, I promise. That's not going to work, Carla. I've been thinking about this for a long time. You need to trust me. I know what I'm doing. You weren't happy. You said it yourself. You gave up your dreams for Nick. You settled here in this lousy little town when all you ever wanted was a studio in Manhattan. Maybe you could have been a famous editor by now. Maybe you still can be. But I like this little town and I love Nick. No, that was a long time ago, Rachel. Come back here. Rachel. Carla stared at the speaker and willed Rachel's voice to flow through it, but she heard nothing. Rachel was gone, and Carla was alone and helpless. The door was sealed. There were no windows to pry open. The room itself was no bigger than a generous walk-in closet. She had no TV, radio, or phone, no way to communicate with anyone. Rachel could forget about her, or get in a car accident, or have a heart attack, or anything, and no one would know Carla was here. She would die here, alone in this room, of starvation. There had to be a way out.
Thank you.
There is an audiobook, and they do it much better than I do. My first audiobook.
So maybe we'll take some questions.
I have two questions. Have any of your crime, I'm sure you've been asked this a million times, have any of your crime reporting stories you've seen migrated away, any of the situations into your books? And the preview of the book that you read on the back cover first, does a writer come up with that first and then write the novel around it? Or do you write the novel and sit back and say, so what do I put on the back cover? Let's do this, because this is kind of the story is.
Well, I'd do that first because that one's easier. We write that after. And that can be, for some people, the hardest part of the novel, trying to whittle it down to that little bit.
Yeah.
For my first two books, it was really easy. For this one, I had a hard time, and for the one that's coming out in April, I had a hard time. So it really depends. But yeah, they write that afterward. Some people get lucky, and the publishers do it for them.
I can answer that too. My book's coming out next year. My publisher just wrote to me and said, I need a photographic copy from you.
Oh,
So
no.
they usually it's out, and it's like, oh, really now? Okay.
Yeah, it's like trying to write the book report nicely, right?
Right.
And I school English teacher.
Summarize in one paragraph.
So I had an English teacher that used to say, now a book report is like a bikini on a lady. I know this was sexist, but this was back in the 70s. He said that a book report is like a bikini on a lady. You want to leave enough exposed to show interest, but you want to leave enough coverage so the real parts don't get exposed.
And then you get that one thing, like I just got from, I think it was from VoucherCon, they want a 100-word blurb for it. So suddenly I have to reduce that to 100 words.
Yeah.
You know, it's
It's the same process for getting an agent or for submitting a book to an editor. You have to boil everything down to usually like one page.
yeah.
As a sales pitch, so it's a good exercise, I guess. I'm not sure what to prepare you for.
Better than film, they've got to do it in a sentence.
Yeah, exactly right.
And the other question, there are elements of my crime reporting news in here for sure. There's one scene in A Dead Man's Eyes where she's remembering how she got to be friends with the medical examiner. And it was after an incident where she had been covering a fatal accident for the first time, and the cops and the firefighters kind of agreed, mostly the firefighters, to bring this body exposed right past her. And that happened to me, where they kind of got me talking by a fire truck, where there's like the ambulance here and the fire truck here, I can't get out. And they brought this body right past me. But little did they know, it was actually good for me, because for me, looking at the body just took all my fear away. There's no humanity in it. You know, the guy was dead. So it was actually, they did me a favor. So that's in there. And then, you know, my ethics as a journalist, I think, are her ethics. I mean, you know, other than that, we don't have a lot in common other than that, but you always have a piece of yourself in there, but it's never good to actually put yourself or your experiences in there, because then you can't, it's harder to inspect them more closely. You make assumptions. You make assumptions that because you remember this, everybody else is going to remember this, and they don't. They have no idea. So for me, if I try to write from my own experience, I skip over things that are probably important. And so, but it was very helpful that I had been a reporter, because I know what Lisa Jameson can do and can't do and how she would operate. And, you know, I wouldn't want to try to write a police procedural, because even though I was around the police a lot and I know a lot of police procedure, I don't feel comfortable, you know, being a cop. It's not what I do best. I do this better. So.
So many elements to this. I mean, your crime reporting and crime in small towns is really interesting, because it seems to, I don't know for everybody else, it seems to be largely invisible in a small town. I'm not sure if that's a, you know, common perception, but you were saying as a crime reporter that you was much sort of more visible than it would be a large city.
It really was. When I was working in the bureaus, you're lucky to have one cop in the entire county. You might have a sheriff's deputy who's on patrol. We don't even have that where I am in Tioga County. They don't have a road patrol for sheriffs. So you might have a sheriff's deputy on patrol. You might have a state trooper who's covering 2 different counties. And I remember one time there was a drowning in Oneida Lake, and I was in Chittenango, 10 miles away. I heard it on the scanner, and I rushed up there, and I got there before the ambulance, before the cops, before anybody. So it was me and the mom on the shore looking for her son. And, you know, then you can't be a reporter. You put your notebook away and you just, you know. And that happened to me quite a few times. There were things I'd rather not have seen that I did see because of that. There was the time, there was a hostage situation in Cazenovia. And that came over the scanner, and Cazenovia was also very close to Chittenango. So I'm thinking, well, the cops are there, they know about it. And I speed down there, and I'm on Main Street, and I'm looking around, and there's nobody there. And I'm right where they said the hostage situation was. So suddenly, this sheriff's lieutenant comes flying up in his car, patrol car, right in front of me, grabs me and throws me down behind the car and says, "You're standing in front of the window." And it's a newspaper employee. It was a guy who'd just been fired from circulation, took his wife hostage, his ex-wife hostage. And so it worked out all right. We talked him down, we got him out of there. But in the city, it was very different. In the city, I don't even know how to explain how different it was. I spent more time investigating the crime in the city, I guess you'd say, trying to figure out who did it. And I don't know how gruesome I want to get here with someone so young around, but I might want to cover your ears for a minute. There was one time when there was a suspect in a homicide, and he wasn't a suspect as far as I knew. The family thought that he might have killed his girlfriend, who was their daughter. And he lived right in the neighborhood. So I thought, well, I'll go over and talk to him. So I knocked on his door, and he invited me in to watch the news with him. And we're watching the news, and we're talking during the news, and suddenly there's a piece about everybody searching for his girlfriend. And I said, well, why aren't you out there searching with them? And he said, well, if I found her, they think I did it. And that's when I knew he did it. Because, I mean, would you think that way? If your girlfriend was missing, would you think I'm not going to go out and look because if I found her, they'd think, and it turned out she was in the backyard. I didn't know it then, but yeah. So that was more of what in the city would be doing more of talking to neighbors, talking to people who knew somebody, trying to get the bigger picture. I mean, you did that in the bureaus as well, but it was easier in many ways in bureaus.
To what degree, I wonder, do some of these cases stay with you emotionally?
Oh, all the time. They're always with me. And that was one complaint I had at the newspaper was that the first responders get therapy and all that stuff, and we didn't. And you have a choice. You can either become hardened to it, or you become overly invested. And I was becoming overly invested. And that's when I decided I needed to get out of crime because it was just, but those emotions that I let myself feel and those experiences that I let myself have helped me tremendously in my writing as well, because they've taught me so much about human nature. And about the fact that, we all like to think we're on this side of good, and but we're equally capable of being on the other side. There's no real line. I mean, we just shift that line in our minds whenever we do something that someone might consider bad or good. Something you've done, had you been someone else, you might have gotten arrested for, So to me, that's always very interesting how we can put ourselves on one side of the line or the other.
I wonder how you feel. I mean, safety is a big topic of conversation just now.
Yeah.
And coming out of COVID, and things are a little wilder than they've been in a while in terms of people's behavior. How do you view, as someone who's seen so much, how do you view kind of the obsession that a lot of the public seems to have at times, especially at times like this, with safety? Do you see it as naive? Do you see it as totally understandable, or somewhere something else?
I think we're opening our eyes finally. I think a lot of this has gone on for a long time. I mean, there were always, if you look at rape, for instance, back before like the 1970s or so, most of the time the guy didn't get arrested, and it just wasn't a crime that was taken as seriously as it should have been. And it took, through the 70s and 80s and 90s for our culture, it wasn't just the police, it was our culture to open its eyes and realize that, rape is a horrible, awful, terrible crime. And even back, I covered a case from where a guy came to me and told me that his mother had killed his two siblings when they were babies. And he had also gone to police. And I just went to the police department and got the reports on both the deaths. It said right here in the reports, she picked up the baby, threw him against the wall. And it's multiple times. And the police didn't arrest her. Because back in the 70s, she was a 16-year-old mom. And they just said, well, this isn't really our business. And they let it go. So, today, you better believe not only would they not let it go, it would be all over the place. But I think social media too has made us a little more frightened. That we know of every crime that goes on everywhere, and so now we're more paranoid and more frightened.
I guess that's the other side that I was sort of thinking of. It's not so much that we've improved in the way that we handle safety and sort of have services for people, do this. But I was raised by a cop and worked in the 70s. And he was very cautious because he'd seen, he was in New York City, he'd seen a lot of things. On the other hand, my mother was a very old woman who would be like, sort of, he'll be all right, he's fine, let him go. So there's that sort of tension between what's real and what's social media amplified. How afraid, I guess,
The reality is that crime is rarely random. It's usually someone you can walk through the most crime-ridden neighborhood in the country and be perfectly fine because you're not a drug dealer, you're not you're not a member of a gang, you might random gunfire, you might get hit, but for the the most part, nobody's gonna come out and attack you. It's, pretty rare, as you probably know, if you're copying a father. You're probably being copied.
I've worked in some of the worst neighborhoods in Brooklyn back in the 90s, and nobody touched me.
Yeah.
And I was just a little white kid walking through predominantly black neighborhoods. I stuck out like a sore thumb. You know, it's sort of like, you're a foreign object kind of
Right.
walking through.
Yeah. So I never worried about anything like that when I was reporting. I go into different situations without thinking about it. Really. You know, I might not do that now with kids, you know, but back then I felt pretty safe.
In Never Let Go, the latest book, you enter the world of illegal adoptions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to say any more than that. So, how much research did you have to do? Did you know something about it? Did you imagine a lot of it?
I did a lot of research on that, and the method in this book is a little different, but it isn't uncommon for someone who's drug addicted and really wants, you know, they can't help it. They want more, they need more, their body needs more, and to offer up their baby for $50, you know, something like that. And I think it happens more than we know. And what really has stuck with me and kind of fueled this part of this book was, and I mentioned this in that book, when I was living in Arizona, they have these things called swap meets, and they're sort of like, you know, flea markets. And I had a newborn and a 1-year-old, almost 2-year-old at the time. And so for me, this really hit home. This woman went to one of these swap meets with her 2-year-old and with her baby, and she needed, her 2-year-old needed to use the porta potty. So she opened the door to the porta potty, she let him in, and she put the infant carrier seat down right here, but then he needed help. And she didn't even think, she just for a second stepped inside there and helped her son, and the baby was gone. And to this day, they still have not found that baby. And for me, you know, people can be very, very judgmental. And I'm thinking, how many times have you been in a bathroom stall when your kid comes out of the bathroom stall and you're not, you know, you don't see him right there. That for a second, you know, you're in a comfort zone and you think you're okay. And that's where she was. The baby was right there. And she just closed the door for a second. So somebody had to have been watching and looking for it. But so that's really torn at me for a long time. And that I think is part of what got me thinking about helping me with her emotions in the book, trying to figure out how would you feel if somebody took your baby. And, you know,
those greatest fears seem to always be at the heart of a lot of crime fiction, literature, film. But you do a great, I just say you do a great job in the book of sort of exposing in the sense of exposition the way that the characters are feeling as these things happen.
Thank you.
It really humanizes, deepens kind of the understanding of the impact.
Thanks.
Yeah. Anybody else? I have a couple of small questions. Oh, sure, please.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A question about writing crime fiction. There are a lot of patterns. I'm addicted to British detective shows. So I watch like every British detective show.
Some of the good ones right now. Yeah.
They're very deep.
They're
not violent. They don't pull out the gun and shoot the guy.
and oddly comforting.
Yeah.
I started watching them when I got sick a couple of years ago and I had a big surgery. So this was like really comforting for you to watch this stuff that dealt with death. It was like, why is this making me feel good? But there are all these tropes. There are these figures that you recognize after a while. You're a storyteller. You know, there are these conventions you come to expect. So as a crime writer, there's so much crime fiction out there. How do you avoid sort of kind of typical, stereotypical situations in crime fiction? How do you make it new? How do you try to make it new? What do you think?
I think for me, I kind of feel like I don't fit in sometimes because most of the crime writers I know read only crime. They read just mystery or suspense or whatever, and that's it. And I have to make myself throw in a mystery mystery or throw in a thriller. Because I tend to gravitate toward, John Irving, Anita Shreve, Jamie Ford, just a little more historical literary stuff. But I love to write crime. But I think part of what helps me is, for one, having actually been involved with crime, but also experiencing those other kinds of literature, and just not getting caught up in, like, I didn't know when I wrote my first crime novel what I was doing. I just wrote it. And a lot of people, I think, look too hard at formulas. They're reading a book, how to write a mystery, and they're following, okay, I gotta do this first, I gotta do this. And the only thing I paid attention to was they said your first chapter, something has to happen, and you have to introduce your antagonist within the first 2 or 3 chapters, because it's not fair to the reader if you don't. So those things are the things that I took to heart. But after that, I just kind of did my own thing and tried to remember that can't remember what it's called, the progression of a story. You start here and you go up here. The story arc. Kept that in mind as I wrote. And I just try to be honest, I guess, and I always try to put myself in the character's place and experience what the character's experiencing, and try to reach into my own experience and see if I can find anything similar. Even though, I might not have had a gun to my head, I've had experiences where I thought I might die. And I can dig deep into that and think, what did my body do in that moment? And what did my mind do in that moment? And try to put that into the fiction. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, and I think as a reporter, I tried very hard never to stereotype someone who was a criminal. Because, this one guy that I told you about who killed his girlfriend, he's not a killer. He's a guy who got in an argument with his girlfriend. He was not mentally, his IQ was not high. He wasn't thinking. They got in an argument. He pushed her. She hit her head, and she was unconscious. So what did he do? He didn't call an ambulance. He put her on his bed, and he left her there until she died, which was a couple of days, because he didn't know what to do. He's like, well, I guess she'll get up. It's so as bad as it was what he did, he's not someone who's going to go out and kill again. So it's hard. How do you typify someone like that? It's
Hollywood tells us you hit somebody, you knock them out, a few minutes later they get up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or they tell you hit someone, knock them out, and they're out for like an hour, and then they wake up in a fall.
You're making me feel good about British crime because a lot of the time it's an accident. I didn't mean to kill them.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
So the nice thing about British crime is the investigators always have some angst. They're disturbed, they have flaws. They have issues that they're dealing with their own demons while they're solving the crimes. And I think that's what makes British crime dramas so interesting. And American crime dramas don't do that. They villainize the perp.
It's interesting.
Or the victim.
They should
not
be
the
doing that, but they
investigator.
don't do it.
I feel like they used to. I feel like they used to. Maybe 30 or 40 years ago, there was more of that. Straddling the cop straddles the line. But I don't know.
Now we
why.
call it noir.
Right.
Yeah, and we actually have a special name for noir.
No,
But in
no.
reality, every novel, the character should be like I will probably want to write one more book of that series, because a series should take the main character, the protagonist, from one point to another, and I feel like she's almost there. I mean, I'll write book 4, and if at the end of book 4 she's resolved her own issues, then we're done. Maybe not. Maybe it'll be book 5, but you'll see now people who write 16 books in a series, and the character arc kind of disappears. It becomes just one adventure after another adventure.
Party boys.
Yeah, it's true. Fun
Introduce
when you're
new plot
teaching.
lines as the old ones are getting wrapped up, so it never really goes away.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that's, I think, how it should be. You should be as interested in the development of the protagonist as you are in the plot, the main plot.
Yeah.
Can we talk about small towns for a minute?
Sure.
So this is a small town novel, the latest one.
Very much like cancer.
Very much like that. So I was like nodding. Yeah, I'm doing a cafe in it, and yeah. So could you talk about the small town as a setting for your fiction? And I was also kind of wondering about the small town as a setting for you, a writer, a storyteller. Right? And how has it? You've lived in bigger towns, you've lived in small towns. How do you feel about being in a small town as a writer?
I love a small town. I get so much. I'm outside the small town where I live, and the support that I get from the community is unbelievable. And I have friends who are living in New York City, and they can't get their books in their neighborhood bookstore. You know, I just feel like, for me, it's very beneficial. But for the small town as a setting, like especially in Never Let Go, for me that was really important because the book is really a lot of the book is about when you grow up with someone, when you're with them all the time, and especially in this case, they're two sets are husband and wife. Do you ever stop to know them again? We tend to make assumptions about people based on how we knew them when we first got to know them. But then when you go through the teenage years and young adulthood, there's a lot of change that happens. Do we stop and get to re-know the person we're with after that change is through? And that's part of the problem with Carla and Nick, is they didn't do that. They made assumptions, and then they got to a crisis point in their marriage that they didn't even know they got to. Yeah, and so for me, the small town atmosphere was important because I'm trying to show all these commitments. I don't want too much disruption in there, too much to separate them and disrupt them. I want them to be able to interact with each other and know each other in town regularly. In a city, somebody might move, a couple neighborhoods over and you never see them again. So.
Yeah, that's perceptive, to say the least. The last thing that I was thinking about is women in your crime fiction. Obviously, your protagonist is a woman.
Oh.
How you deal with portraying women in certain ways. Like the antagonist in this novel is Rachel, who is in some ways kind of that deranged, right? Deranged by passion or like romantic desire,
Right.
How do you worry, I guess, you have anxiety about portraying that kind of woman?
I didn't at first, and actually, with her, no one's commented on that.
Okay.
Not anyone. It's more the little things in the novel. I had one person call me a fat shamer. And I'm like, I'm fat. What are you talking about? The part about her with her, saying she's grateful she still has that dough, and just stuff like that. I'm like, what? I didn't know where that came from in there, and just little things like that. And then in the other novels, you don't get anywhere in a crime suspense novel if somebody doesn't do something that is probably not wise once in a while. If they do something, if they take the smart move every time, they'll never be in danger, it won't be any fun. And so every now and then, Lisa will do something that maybe she should have told someone before she went, or something like that. And there's this one reviewer who hates that. She says, "There we go again, Lisa doing something stupid." And I'm thinking, if a guy did this, would you say that? If he decides to go and see if he can dig up the body on his own, nobody thinks twice. But she goes to dig up the body on her own, and so I didn't worry about it that much because those are like two people, out of all these people. But I do worry about making sure they're strong characters and they're strong people, and that they get themselves out of their own situations, that they're not rescued. But I think that's important whether it's a male or a female protagonist. That if you want a protagonist that people can look up to and can cheer for, they should be saving themselves. Yeah.
Do you find it easier to write men or women, or does it not matter to you?
It doesn't really matter to me. I can get into a woman's head more easily, and I think that men would prefer for me to write a woman and get into that than try to write a man. Does that make any sense? it just, I could, but I enjoy writing for a female perspective, I guess, is, you know, I do have, like Nick is, and I write his point of view in that book. So I don't know how I did.
There are actually two major male characters.
And Sawyer, yeah,
Right.
Sawyer too, yeah. So I haven't really gotten any feedback on that, so I don't know how, and I've read a lot of books where men wrote female lead characters, and I thought they've done a wonderful job. But I've also read the opposite of both. Women who've written terrible male characters and men who've written stereotypical female characters. So,
It's an interesting dilemma for authors who,
Yeah.
you know, we're told to use our imaginations and to get inside characters' heads, but if you reach too far, sometimes people, you know,
yeah,
people take umbrage, like reviewers will take up. The ultimate example of that's like William Styron wrote Confessions of Nat Turner, who was a slave in 1830,
yeah.
and he's a white man writing in California.
That's something I probably wouldn't do. I never broken one of the main characters in there is black, and I never got in his head. I wrote him as everyone else interacted with him because I can't even pretend to know what might have gone through his head. And I did have a sensitivity reader read the book as well, and just to make sure.
There is such a thing as a sensitivity reader?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Where do you get one?
Actually, I went through a friend of mine who worked at a university. And she's black, and her mother was my best friend in high school. Her mother's white, so you got to be careful that you get someone who understands the culture and understands the book world and all that stuff. I mean, there's a real art to being a sensitivity reader. And she worked in a university and was friends with people at other universities and their English departments and all that stuff. So she recommended a guy who works in the diversity program at, can't remember what university it is. Anyway, he really wanted to get into this and to do sensitivity reads. And he was very good. He was, you know, because you can get people who are just angry and they trash your book, and then what do you do now? Once you publish it, this person might vocalize, you know, and I don't know. It's a tough thing, but I felt it was worth doing. Some people are afraid of it. I wasn't afraid of it. Because
It's really easy to fall into the trap of cultural misappropriation.
it is, yeah.
And you truly can do it innocently and ignorantly at the same time.
I think the key is to always, no matter what race or ethnicity your character is, just to treat him like a human. You know, but then again, the reason I wouldn't want to get in his head, I read a book by Ada Block. Have you ever read any of hers? She wrote Pleasantville, the novel set in Texas. And this lawyer, she's black, and all of her characters pretty much are black in her novels. And this lawyer's office had been broken into. He discovers it at around midnight. And the way she writes him waiting for the cops, everything is so natural and fluid that if you're reading too fast, you might leave right through it. But he gets out of his car, he's wearing a suit, but he gets out of his car and stands near it, waits for the cop to come, and he automatically puts his hands up, you know, when he sees the cop before he talks to him. But it's just such a fluid, quick thing. But it also makes it more real. Because you're a black man at midnight outside of a building that was burglarized. So, you know, and I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know those little things. You know? And so that's why I wouldn't want to write a character who's of another race or of another ethnicity, because I don't know those little things. And I probably couldn't do it justice. You know? So my characters are more how other people perceive him and how he comes across to them, and you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting problem. Even writing humor, which I do sometimes, you still, even though it's humor, and humorists have a big problem with this, including stand-up comedians, because it's impossible to write humor without offending someone.
Oh yeah,
Virtually
yeah.
impossible.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting.
Yeah. I talk to my boys about that all the time because they think they're funny.
And what was humor in the 1970s is not
Not
funny today.
funny.
What I grew up with as being funny as hell
Yeah.
is
yeah,
not funny today. And
No,
I
it is
think we have
not.
to accept
It wasn't funny then, but we thought it was because.
But we
you know,
thought it was.
Yeah,
Within my
yeah.
circle it was.
Yeah, yeah,
And that was wrong, but we know now.
Yeah.
So I'm a storyteller.
oh, yeah.
And cultural misappropriation is something I monitor all the time.
Mhm.
And for that reason, I do very, very few Native American stories.
Yeah,
Because it's not my culture. They don't belong to me. They're not my stories. And some of the groups, Native American groups, are far more protective of the stories than others are.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's just that whole thing, because you truly, if you can't see the lesson through their eyes,
right.
you don't have the right to tell the story through their eyes. You know what I mean? That's not the best verbalization of it. But I stay away from those stories mostly for that reason, because I can't relate.
In my first novel, in Dead Man's Eyes, I have some, there's an incident at the border where they're sneaking, actually, no, it's never broken, where they're sneaking, bringing people over the border. And at first I had them use Akwesasne, the Mohawk Reservation. I grew up near there and, we covered a lot of incidents there. And one of my friends from high school runs a museum up in the Adirondacks, Native American Museum. And he said, no, he says, please don't do that because you're just, you're perpetuating that stereotype and we're trying to change up there. We're trying, all that. So it was easy enough to change that. And then in it didn't affect the story. I mean, it now opened my eyes a little bit though,
It gets complicated. I mean, I write, when I started my career as a writer, I was writing a lot of very self-consciously Italian American stuff, and I am Italian American.
Yeah.
And people within the group
yeah,
would object because a lot of what I was writing was comedy, and it was playing on stereotypes.
yeah.
And they were not happy with the fact it was playing with the stereotypes. Even just playing with them, kind of trying to tear them down, didn't matter. So you really have to be amazing,
Yeah.
kind of threading a needle.
In the book, Spring Melt, which is a historical courtroom drama, it's set in the Adirondacks in the 1920s. And there is a thread in that book about a boy, the prosecutors, the defending attorney's son is Native American, but he and his wife didn't tell him because she was a descendant of Sir Walter Johnson, who fathered multiple children with Native Americans in New York State, hundreds of children. And she looked more white than she did Native American. And so she was embarrassed by her history, but he runs away. He doesn't run away, he leaves, I should say. He's 15 and he's upset that this has been denied him all this time. And he's really interested in his heritage and he goes to the Onondaga Nation to kind of hunker down for a while and learn more about his heritage and that kind of stuff. So kind of a secondary plot throughout the novel is he and his wife coming to terms with their son wanting this, But you better believe I'm going to have my friend read this book before it goes to print because I want to make sure, especially with Sir Walter Johnson and all that. I don't want to. I mean, I'm not going to change the plot, but I can change the way I've written things in it to make sure that people focus on the story and not the stereotype or any of that stuff.
And that kind of sensitivity level or perceptions of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable sort of, I think, change over time. Not in the way that, but they also sort of, it's pendulum. It's not just straight line, I think.
Yeah.
It's pendulum. Reaction over, counter reaction.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, well, maybe a discussion for another day.
Yeah.
So about the next, do you want to say anything about the work you're working on now, or what you're working on next?
Right now, I'm working on book 3. Well, it's in the developmental edits and all that stuff right now. Book 3 in the series, No Time to Breathe. And then I would have to do edits on whichever of the standalones is coming out next. Like I said, it's supposed to be the historical, but I worry because I just put out a thriller that people are going to expect another thriller from. and be disappointed if they read Spring Melt, and then confused if I then put out another thriller.
Do you
So-
want to give us a hint about the premise?
Of the other thriller? Yep. The next thriller is actually set where I'm living now, in the, kind of in the, I have to call Knoxville Deerfield, because it's Deerfield Township, and even people who live in Knoxville, when I gave them the book to beta read, and it says the hills of northern Pennsylvania, the lush hills, all this stuff, they said, oh, it's set in Tennessee. It says Pennsylvania. So other than that, I mean, I haven't, other than the one in the Adirondacks, I have not written in a real setting until this book. And, but it has to do with a woman who, she and her husband have always been traveling around. For his job, he's moved every couple of years. So they've never really put down roots. And even when she was growing up, her parents would up and move all the time. So she never put down roots as a child either. And then they moved back here to his hometown. They're very wealthy, so he's able to use a private runway. There are actually a couple of those in Knoxville. And a charter plane to go back and forth to his company headquarters when he needs to go. And she knows she was born in the area, but she thinks that was just as her parents were kind of passing through. They were on their way from New Jersey to Rochester. She went to labor and she gave birth. But then she starts receiving death threats when she's there. And then I won't tell you more beyond that. But she thinks she's a stranger in town, and she's finding out she's not. So it has to do with that, and also with the more of a character arc for her is this whole idea of putting down roots and trying to be in one place and stay in one place, and develop those relationships and that trust that comes with being. But that was fun to write because it is set there, and I had just moved there when they wrote it. And, it was fun. But it'll be interesting to see how that's received locally. Yeah, if people will say, "Oh, you got that right," or "Oh, you really screwed up."
I'm guessing some people will have something to say.
Yeah,
one way or the
yeah,
other. So,
yeah.
Anything else? Or- Cool.
I did want to tell you that A Dead Man's Eyes, even though that series is not, she's not me. She was inspired by people I knew at the newspaper. There was this one woman, Ladada Grimes, who was she was 22, I think, when she came to the newspaper, up from either Tennessee or Kentucky. I'm not sure where she came from originally. By herself, not knowing a soul, with a 2-year-old, to work at the newspaper. And I was floored by her, because how do you do that? You don't know anybody. You're 22 years old. You're in a job that demands that you're able to work any hours they tell you to, unpaid overtime all the time, working 80 hours a week, and that kind of thing. And she is now, she's unbelievably successful. She's down in Tennessee now. She's high up in the newspaper there. Her daughter graduated summa cum laude, knows Mandarin Chinese. She herself, the Dada, just produced and directed a documentary with someone else that's debuting out there all over the place right now. so it's just amazing for me to see how she persevered. And then we had another report also about a teenager, and she had been a single mom. She had the father in the picture, so she had that help. But I just couldn't see how you could do it and do it well as a single parent, and both of them did it. So that's kind of where Lisa comes from, is and a girl that I met when I was covering a fire. I was covering the fire. I'd already interviewed everybody. Fire was almost out. I was just waiting for the chief or assistant chief to get back to me with what he suspected was the cause. So I'm standing around, and it was about probably 11 o'clock at night. And I noticed this girl standing right next to me. I turned around, and she was pregnant. And we got talking. She was 15 years old, and she was telling me how she was going to keep this. She was in foster care, but she was going to keep this baby. She was going to go to Onondaga Community College. She was going to provide for this kid. And there was something about her that I felt like she was going to do it. She was really smart. She just had bad situations all along. And she told me her name, but her name rang a bell with me. So I just couldn't get it out of my mind. I went back to the office and I started going through my computer files and all this stuff and my notes, and I found it. there was a girl by the same name who would have been the same age who witnessed a game of Russian roulette, fatal game of Russian roulette. And that stuck with me because I kept thinking, was it her? I mean, was she the one who went through all this, and then did she go through all this and then become stronger from it and all that? So Lisa Jameson, her story is she ran away from home when she was 15. Her parents were drug addicts; they really didn't care, and she got pregnant by her boyfriend, and they had planned to stay together, but there was a fatal game of Russian roulette, and they were all sent home to their parents. After being interviewed by the police and all that, she was placed in foster care. So at that time, that would have been before email was a big thing and all that. She loses contact with the father, and time goes by, and it gets harder and harder to renew those kind of relationships. So this is 16 years later, when her daughter was 16 years old, and the next story she has to cover is the murder of her daughter's father. And so it's part of the story is about the relationship between the mother and the daughter, and her having to deal with the fact now that she never told her daughter that her father was right there in the city, not far from them, and try to explain herself and mend that relationship. And the other part of it is trying to, wanting to know who killed him and why.
How on earth to keep all those outlines straight?
I actually forget sometimes. I forget what's in what book. Especially when you're waiting for the next one to come out, you forget that other people haven't read it yet.
Yeah. Do you work with outlines and charts, or not? You just
No, but I'm not a total pantser reader, as you call it. I kind of know where I'm going to get in the end, and when I start, but I don't necessarily know how I'm going to get there. And that's just how I prefer to write. And often the ending changes. Like in Never Let Go, I didn't expect an ending. And, it just kind of felt right in the end. So.
I'm give it away.
Did it bother you, or did you like it?
Are we talking about the climax, or the
very
end? The very end. I didn't. It's the first book of yours I've read. So I didn't know the character, but I could feel that there was going to be more of this character based on the ending. That's what I thought, frankly. Yeah, that's kind of what I knew. There was another story buried in what happens at the very end.
There were probably only about 2 people, I think, who commented on they didn't like the way that particular plot ended, because it didn't wrap up as tightly as.
Part of the fun with crime fiction is following the main character into their next and what's going on in their life. So well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. This is great, and I hope you'll come back sometime when your next book is out.
Well, thanks.
Do this again.
Yeah, it'll be fun. Thanks for having me.
Oh, pleasure.
Oh,
Thanks.
very
So, Lori does have some books available.
If you want. I also have a newsletter where I interview a different author every month. If you want to sign up for that at all. So, going to catch him just before his novel comes out. Get him in that newsletter.
And also, part of the evening here is we do an open mic, so if anybody wants to get up and
I would love to hear somebody's reading.
I'm looking around.
No. Do you guys have anything you're going to
I'd
read?
be glad to tell a story.
No. You want to tell us about it? Yes.
Sure.
Good. Cool. I'm going to come and sit next to. Do you mind if I sit here, please?
When you have the time, I lose track of time. How often do we go?
I purposely did not bring a watch. And I also, no offense to us, but I don't need your microphone.
Oh, good.
I tend to find them more of a
Road
hindrance.
aside.
But you know what would be handy in these types of events is a bar stool, a bar height stool.
We have one, and I forgot to bring it up.
Yeah, that'd be
We do
cool.
have one. Yeah.
Anyway, my name's Quinn Golden, and I'm a storyteller. That's what I do. I chase open mics frequently, and a lot of times they're at pubs. So you have an acoustic open mic, you've got people playing the guitar, and I just put my name on the list and I wait and they call me up. And I take the stage and I say, my name's Quinn Golden, I'm a storyteller. Now a storyteller is somebody that has the ability to memorize the lyrics, but lacks the talent to play an instrument. And I launch into a story. But you're awesome, and I greatly admire what you do, and don't know how you could, in order to maintain those plot lines, I'd have to have a wall the size of this with 100,000 Post-it notes on it with threads going to every one to try to keep them sane. But I'm a storyteller, and I tell folk tales and fables, and I really like telling contemporary stories. And a lot of the contemporary stories that I tell a little on the dark side, just because those are the stories that I particularly like. So this story is not terribly dark, but it is quite contemporary. From a storyteller's perspective, contemporary stories, stories that have been created in the last 15, 20, 30, 40 years. Because most storytellers tell fables and folklore and stories that are 100 years old or 1,000 years old. I have a good friend that tells Gilgamesh. If you happen to be unfortunate enough to be an English major, you would have to know the story of Gilgamesh and how far back that goes. So I like to tell contemporary stories. Now, this is a story that was written by a man named Geoffrey Lewis. Now, Geoffrey Lewis was a star of stage and screen. You may have remembered him from the movies. He did walk-on bits on television shows like on Bonanza and Gunsmoke. But he was that quirky little bald-headed guy on Every Which Way But Loose. He was the orangutan handler, right, little bald guy. And he always played kind of a bumbling comedian type role or an ultra villain in his movies. But he loved to tell stories. And when he wasn't on the screen, he would often say that, yeah, I make movies and I do television, but that's just to earn my living. But when I want to act, I tell stories. So he's at the Matrix Theater one night and he's spinning yarns, he's telling stories. And he's telling stories that he wrote, which is really unusual for somebody to write their own stories and then tell their own stories. But that's what he does. So he's telling his stories at the Matrix Theater. And over here on the side, there's this guy named Jeffrey Levin who's listening to him. Now, Jeffrey Levin is a singer in a pop band in the 60s, in the late 60s. It was called People, an exclamation point at the end. They actually charted with a song. They were on the Dick Clark Show, American Bandstand. And for a very short period of time, they actually were climbing in the charts. And then they had some issues and they fell apart. But Jeffrey Levin is sitting here, he's listening to Jeffrey Lewis and thinking, I could put my music underneath his stories. And he did. And they got together and they produced 8 albums of stories, just stories with music on them. And it's wonderful stuff. So I hooked into his stories many years ago and started to learn them. I reached out. Now, Jeffrey Lewis, we lost him in 2015. He's been gone for a bit. But Jeffrey Levin is still alive. He's still living out in California. He writes scores for movies. His name is tied to some real good popular movies. And I began to write with him, and he began to write back. And he gave me permission to share their stories, which is really, really cool. So this is a contemporary story, and it's called Roller Rink. And it's one of my favorite. Now, this is a story. It's not a personal experience of mine. I'm simply going to share it with you. Because one summer, when I was a boy, my parents thought that I should go and spend some time with my grandparents out in the country. And I rode the bus all by myself. I felt so grown up, watching out the window of the bus as the grime of the city gave way to the green pristine of the country. I just felt like anything was possible. Like going over a bridge, looking down at that clear water underneath it. It reflected and shined like flecks of gold in the bottom of the pond. Cows off in the distance bowing their heads in the pasture. I ate the sandwich my mom made for me, and late in the afternoon, the bus pulled up in this little four-corner town in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And I stepped out into this bright sunshine that I had never seen before in my life. The newly planted corn off in the fields, the tips were silver in the reflected sunlight. It was so beautiful and clear. Insects buzzing around in the air. And off on the side were my grandparents and my grandpa in his old pickup truck, and they were waving at me, and I waved back. I was so excited. I ran right over to see them. The bus driver had to call me back. Hey, boy, you want your bags? I was so excited. I rode out to my grandpa's farm in the back of that pickup truck that day. That summer on the farm, I saw a calf being born. I learned to swim in Miller's Pond. I'd help the hired hands roll the cows out every morning and then go out every night and bring the cows back into the barn. I rode on the hay cutter with my grandpa. Dolly and Bess, the two big field horses, they pulled it right along, but we let them rest every 20 minutes or so in the corner of the shade by the stone wall. It was so hot that summer. And I'd sit there with my grandpa, and we'd sit on that stone wall, and we just talk about anything. Watch the snake.
Sorry, I gotta go.
That's okay. I watched the snake swim across the stock pond. I watched clouds change shapes that summer as the afternoon thunderstorms would roll on in. Every Wednesday night, after the dinner dishes was done, we'd hop in my grandpa's old pickup truck, and we'd go into that little four-corner square town in the middle of nowhere, and we'd go to the roller rink. Oh, I love the roller rink. It was an old place, and it smelled kind of musty, and it was kind of dirty, but my grandpa would rent me a pair of skates, and I'd sit on that long bench by the skate counter. My grandma she'd help me lace them on. I'd get out there and I'd skate around and around. The green paint was chipping off the walls, and there was posters of events from long ago. A lot of them was ripped and faded, but you could still read most of them. And I'd skate underneath the rows of old Christmas lights overhead that no one ever bothered to take down. And I'd skate around and around, sitting over there in the corner on the bleachers, shoulders touching, both wearing hats, holding hands with my grandparents. And every time I'd skate around, they'd wave at me with their free hand, and I'd wave back. In those moments in time, everything just felt connected. You know what I mean? Everything just felt right. Well, the summer went on, and nights got cooler, and a couple mornings there was some frost, and leaves started to drop. And one morning, my grandma had a big, huge breakfast. All the field hands came in, and the neighbors come over, and it was time for me to go home. And I hopped on that bus, and I rode on it back out of the prison. And I didn't feel all grown up. I felt kind of vulnerable and sad, riding along and watching the green fields disappear to the grime of the city, looking out the window, tears just streaming down my face. Back in the city, there was a shooting that winter. Then there was another one, and some folks got robbed, and I didn't understand what was happening. Things had changed. Nothing was the same. But I grew up and got through school, and then I went in the army. And well, the army did what it did, taught me how to kill people, and I went off across the ocean, and I did my job and come back home. And I went off to school, and I finished school, and I met a girl too. I met a real nice girl, and we got married. We settled down and had this little house just outside of the city and lived in it. And I was a writer. Wrote my first novel. Things got pretty good for a while, and we had 2 kids, boy and a girl. Then Ron took her away from me, took her away. But I moved back. I sold that house, and then moved back into the city in the apartment, and so my kids would be okay. And I stopped writing a second novel. I took a second job, but they was okay, and raised them up, and got them off and off towards school. But my son, he had to be just like Dad. He had to go in the army, and they shipped him off overseas, and he didn't come home. And my daughter, she went off to school in California, and she met a fellow out there and got married. And they're doing really well. They got two fine kids, my grandchildren. And, well, they come and visit every once in a while. I see them, but it's okay. And I sit here now in my apartment, and I think, I look at the pictures, and I think about my wife and my all too short career, and my friends, and lost them in the wars, and think about the government and things that they're doing. And I think about that revolver movement, like in war. I probably think of that a little too much. Well, one particularly gray day, I got up and I left that apartment, went out and boarded that bus, and I headed off to that little square corner town out in the middle of nowhere again. It was long after dark when I got there. I found that roller rink. All the lights were out. Pushed on the doors a little bit, and the door was open, and I get in. Turn on the lights, the light come on. The place hadn't changed a bit. It still smelled all musty. All the green paint on the wall was still peeling. And I poked around behind the counter and found some skates that would actually fit me. And I sat back on that bench beside the skate counter there, and I put on a pair of them skates, and I laced them up real tight, stood up. You know, what was he thinking moment? I pushed off from the wall and began to skate. Well, it come kind of hard at first, you know, but then I kind of got into it. And it worked, and I started to skate. I skated, and I skated around and around by them old posters that was mostly peeled and torn, but you could still read them. And under them rows of Christmas lights that no one had ever bothered to take down. And I skated around and around. And there over in that corner, sat there, shoulders touching, holding hands, both wearing hats, was my grandparents. As I went by for the last time, they waved to me. And suddenly, everything in life just made sense again and was connected. Thank you. Hope you liked it. Any questions? I like to ask questions.
Well, I'm curious about, I'm curious about the origin of that story. If you ever asked where that story came from.
Yeah, you know, there was a bunch of stories that are like that are deep like that he tells, and a bunch of just lighthearted, easy, fun stories. I asked the question, you know, where does this stuff come? And he just said, they're just stories. Sometimes stories are just stories. So
That was a beautiful one.
and that one has a lot of familiarity to me because I see my grandparents, you know, and so there are stories that they hit you. They're not your stories, but there are certain elements of them that hit you. And my grandparents meant a great deal to me growing up. I grew up in a house that was fueled with alcohol and violence, and my grandparents were, a very stable rock for me growing up. And so telling stories, I tend to mentally drop them into that picture. And, you know,
I wonder, do you pick stories to tell based on those resonances? Based on what resonates with you?
I think we always
all do.
Sure. I think we all do. The stories that we, truly love to tell. But I mean, you need a really wide repertoire of stories to, you can't always tell dark stories. Although they are my favorites to tell. You can't always tell them. You have to tell folk tales and fables and, fairy tales.
How did you get into this?
What's that?
How did you get into this? Into storytelling?
Well, cute story. I actually, through my working career, I did a variety of type jobs, generally surrounding like mechanical engineering type sorts of things. But I worked for and with a lot of manufacturers. And I joined an organization that taught manufacturers how to manufacture. So concepts like just in time and Kanban and green belt, Japanese methods of manufacturing and all that. But these are mind-numbing subjects to try to teach and to try to talk about. So over the course of time, from listening to other people talk and tell stories, I began to weave stories in. You know, you can only talk to people just so long. They aren't sitting on nice, comfortable couches. You know, they're sitting on folding tin chairs, right? And the mind doesn't grasp any more than the ass can handle. So you would put some stories into it to try to break things up. And after a while, it was like, you know, they're more interested in the stories than they are in the topic matter. And I told more and more of them. And after a while, there was a fellow that said, you know, that Golden would rather tell stories than talk about, you know, just-in-time manufacturing. I thought, yeah, geez, yeah, you're right. You're kind of right. And so as time evolved and the kids grew, and I have 6 children, and eventually they moved off and headed off in the world on their own. And my wife and I began to have some more time, and all those evenings I spent teaching and, you know, at these meetings, I kind of reverted over and started storytelling.
I had another question about closure, closed ending versus the open ending, but I think I'd rather ask you this question, which is dear to my heart. So I've always had kind of like a Buddhist perspective that I can never follow through on, which is like you should be in the present moment. The best place to be is right here, and not get caught up in nostalgia, not live on your memories, even when you're 85.
Yeah.
Don't do that. However, telling stories kind of cuts against that. We're all storytellers. It's almost pathological if you look at it from that perspective. Like, we need to go back and tell stories versus just being here.
The human mind is wired for stories.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, Jim Henson said it best when he said, when in times when we remembered our past through story and made sense of our present through story and attempted to foretell our future through story, the best place by the fire was saved for the storyteller. Right? I mean, we're wired for stories. That's what we do. And thanks to George and McFadden's and whatnot, we run a storytelling group here on the 3rd Tuesday of every month. And we'd love to have, you know, all of you here. But it's a great group, and we had some folks here that thank you. But yeah, it's great because we're all storytellers, right? If you're married, you're a storyteller. If you're employed and have been gainfully employed, you're a storyteller, one way or another. If you have parents that are aging, you've listened to their stories 100 million times, and by the way, you're a storyteller. So it's just a matter of, you know, of running those stories in. So storytelling is interesting because, like, you have the Moth Radio Hour, you know, on NPR, and storytelling. At this point in time, there was a renaissance in storytelling about 30 years ago, and it kind of faded out. And now the current revival in storytelling are these, you know, personal accomplishment stories, like those moth stories. People talking about, you know, breaking through adversities and, you know, coming out on the other side and being better for it. You hear a great deal of that, which seems to be currently the popular mode of storytelling. But, you know, I consider myself an entertainer and do folk tales and.
That's a really interesting question too for people who tell stories on the page. You know, could I get up? Like, you got up and read the first chapter, and it sounded good. And it sounded like a story you could have told. And there's that relationship. I think we all think about it as fiction writers. Is this coming across as too artificial? And there is fiction that is intentionally artificial and experimental, but most of us don't read or write that. So we're always striving for that natural voice, and that's an interesting. I wonder how natural you feel the voices are that you're performing, or do you feel that they're more theatrical, heightened? That's always a tension. Heightened voice versus.
I strive to do conversational storytelling, and I truly don't know if I succeed in that or not, or if it, you know, comes off as being dramatic. Obviously, you have to put some drama in it, and sometimes you have to use multiple voices, you know, and keep them straight. But yeah, I try to do more conversational type.
Yeah, I definitely endorse the storytelling. So it kind of gives everybody a chance to actually, who's never done it before. I'm hoping to get the guts up to come here and tell a story.
I thought-
Script in front of me.
My kids listen, my older kids especially, listen to podcasts all the time. And some of that is just straight out storytelling. Like, my daughter got me listening to this one encounter with a beaver. You know, that this guy was out and he was talking about how he out for a hike, and then he sees this beaver in this dam, and she just absolutely loved it. It was like 45 minutes of this encounter with a beaver, and it was so well done.
Yeah.
It's I think podcasts are giving that another outlet.
They are.
So-
And there are, TikTok is another awesome outlet. So there's a TikTok storyteller that I follow, and she's actually into Dungeons and Dragons, which I know nothing about. But there is a whole underlying story and theme, and the stories constantly change with the characters. So she does these stories for Dungeons and Dragons. But she also does what she calls tiny folk tales, and then tiny dark tales, I think she calls them. And she's really incredibly good. And she's a writer, and she tells her own stories. And I've heard some of them, so I wrote to her. And I said, I'm a storyteller, and I really like what you do. Would you be willing to let me tell your stories? And she said, oh, absolutely. She said, no problem. She said, just tell them, and if anybody asks, give me the credit. So the TikTok followed. And one of her short stories that she did, if I can have 2 more minutes. So she told this story. There was a young boy who found a golden key hanging from a moss-covered tree at the edge of the forest. He held it in his hand, and when he looked at it, he felt like anything was possible. He loved its golden glint as it lay in his hand. He spent all the time he could trying to find what lock this key fit, and he found none. He grew up and went to the city and became a locksmith. And every time he was tasked with making a key for a lock, he would try this key into the lock and see if it fit. And it never did. But the city was wide open to him. And he appreciated and went to its restaurants and its concerts and its social clubs. And the girl who played the harp in the town square on Sunday mornings, her music was alive to him. And it split his heart wide open. And a year later, they were married. And they grew old together for a very long time. And one day, as always happens, her harp stopped playing. And a year later, death came for him. And as death approached him, he said, before you take me, if you would please, when I was a very young boy, I found this golden key. Can you tell me what fits? And she looked at it. She said, well, all your life, did you always have what you need? He said, oh, yes. He said, I had all I needed and then some. I've been very fortunate. She said, good. And the key did its job. And as she embraced him, she took that key into her hand and blew it away like a dandelion on the wind to land someplace else and be found again. And so that's a TikTok for you.
Wow.
So, there is some wonderful material out there in contemporary storytelling. Yeah.
Really integral area. There's even a podcast called American History Tellers,
Yeah.
and called American History Tellers, and they incorporate a lot of storytelling techniques into what is otherwise just sort of straight history,
Mm-hmm.
and it really works.
Yeah, I thought would be a great retirement. I'm retired, but a great retirement gig would be to settle in with one of these, like go to Mount Vernon and George Washington. You get on Mount Vernon, and the people that are at Mount Vernon are marvelous storytellers, telling you about George Washington and about, not even talking about George Washington, but it's talking about Mount Vernon, the estate, and the slaves, and the relationships, and the cooks, and the cookhouse was separate from the main house in case it caught fire, it wouldn't burn the main house down. And there's 100,000 stories down there. I thought that would be a great retirement gig, is to be in a place like that. I've actually written to the Genesee Valley Museum, Country Museum. I've written to them twice, offering, and they've not written back once.
Really? They take you up with that.
I know. I actually wrote to them and heard nothing back, and then I responded to a Facebook post, and I said, "Hey, they said, oh yeah, write to this person," and I did, and I still heard nothing back.
You could become the tourist attraction here, the sanatorium stories.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody's telling those. I don't know if you know.
I didn't know there was a sanatorium here.
Jackson Sanatorium is up on a hill here and began in 1858.
Wow.
And its life went to 1970 in different iterations, but there's some amazing stories, amazingly famous people.
Is that the one they do tours of?
No, I really can't even go up there, but I can imagine Quinn going up there and staying in a safe distance.
Yeah. And Dansville, towns have awesome stories. I mean, there's a street here in town called Battle Street, it's called Battle Street for a reason. There was a battle there. And not in, Revolutionary War times. It was a lot more recent than that, over the canal system. The merchants wanted the canal between the center of town and the Genesee, Valley canal system. And the merchants went and dug this canal all the way to it. And the state, building the Genesee Canal, wouldn't allow the merchants canal to tie into the main canal. And they said, well, we dug it. It's all here. Just take down the last 4 feet of dirt. And that way the merchants can put their, our stuff. Because in those days, there was massive nurseries here. Plant stock was grown here. And there was a shoe shop. And they wanted to put their stuff and get it into the canal without having to truck it all the way down. And the people who had built the canal, the merchants got together. And they literally, baseball bats and shovels and pickaxes, and they went after the state employees who were digging the canal, and there was this battle. I mean, people were hurt and bloody and injured and sued and legal proceedings afterwards. But in the end, they got their canal through to the state canal, and they got it done. And the remnants of that is Battle Street. And a lot of folks don't know why it's called Battle Street.
I didn't know that.
But it's a marvelous story. So yeah, all these towns have just great stories. Just gonna dig them up.
The stories from my childhood are what inspired my historical novel, just because the Adirondacks are just a confluence of, I mean, you've got the Native American community, you've got the New York City socialites coming up to vacation, you have the TB people coming up for the cure, including the Will Rogers Institute, which housed the musicians. And then my father's own family, he had rum runners who, during Prohibition, were running alcohol up down across the border, and had run-ins with the Montreal Mafia.
My dad grew up on the Erie Canal.
Oh, yeah?
A lot of stories.
Yeah.
So the sanitarium here was a water cure at one time.
Oh, really?
It was water cure. Now, you want to talk about stories and families? I'm sure, I'm going to hope you're familiar with the novel Peyton Place,
Yeah.
the resulting movie. That's my family.
Oh, really?
Those are my aunts and uncles.
Wow.
Oh yeah, the murder, buried him underneath the sheep pen and all that. Yeah, that's all very real. It's not a novel. I mean, it's a novel. It's based on
Wow.
a real small town.
Ooh, that must have been
You said
strange for
murder
you
in
to
a
see
small
that come
town,
out.
so, yeah.
Yeah.
But it was actually, it's a generation or two before me.
Wow.
But they were my great aunts and uncles, my grandfather's family.
Oh. I had an uncle and a cousin of my father's who were rum runners, and they were just drunks, total drunks. And they went to Montreal to pick up alcohol. They were drunk off their butts at a club when it was robbed. And the people who were robbing them said, everybody get down on the floor and now hand over your jewelry and your wallets and all this stuff. And they got talking to each other and decided they could take these guys. So when decided they could take them.
Oh.
So when they came around to them, and this is one of the stories I grew up on, when they came around to them and wanted them to give them up their jewelry and all that stuff, they tackled them, and somebody got shot and killed by the robbers. And they were, of course, that caused an even bigger scene. The cops came and these guys were arrested. But the Canadian government was afraid to let my father's uncle and cousin go because they were afraid they wouldn't get them back for the trial. So they kept them in custody in Montreal until trial. They got up on the stand and they were asked to retell what happened. And they kept saying, I don't remember. Because they didn't. They were so drunk. They didn't remember. They didn't even know what they did. But from then on, whenever they went back to Montreal, everything was paid for. Wherever they went. And they finally figured out it was the Montreal Mafia. And the Montreal Mafia must have thought they intentionally said they couldn't remember. And so